What's going on, guys? Market Performance Auto Center here, and today we're going to be installing this hybrid turbocharger on a Veloster N. Alright, so now that we got the car in the shop, let's get it set up and ready to take it apart. First, we're going to begin by removing the exhaust and the downpipe, along with a few other components. Then we'll move on to the lower engine mount, the front suspension, and ultimately we're going to be removing the entire front subframe. Now that the subframe's out of the way, we get a nice look at that turbocharger, all the coolant piping and oil feeds. And you can see just how much room we have to work with here. After draining out all of the coolant and engine oil, we'll move on to removing the exhaust manifold nuts. Now, in our particular case, upon removal, the actual stud came out with the nut, but in many other cases, it could come out with just the nut. It could come out like this as well. In this case, it did come out altogether, so we're just going to do a quick thread retap before reinstalling it, but now that the nuts are all removed and the studs are all removed, it does make it a lot easier to remove the turbocharger. As you can see, we've got a little bit more wiggle room now that the studs aren't there, but some slow patience and wiggling, and she's out. Now that we have the turbocharger out of the car, we can begin fitting all of the parts onto the new hybrid turbo. First, we'll start by installing a set of downpipe studs from ARP. Then we'll transfer the coolant and oil fittings from the old turbocharger onto the hybrid turbo, being careful to replace the O-rings that are on the banjo bolts, securing it to the turbocharger housing. And finally, we'll transfer the electronic wastegate actuator. At this stage, we'll take care to clock the cold side of the turbocharger. If it's clocked incorrectly, this can inhibit the proper performance of the wastegate actuator rod and the wastegate control. Now that everything is buttoned up, let's get the turbocharger back in the car. Now we're going to slowly wiggle the turbocharger back into its home spot. With all the studs installed, we can now torque the nuts to specified value, ensuring they're not over torqued to pose any possible issues in the future if it ever has to be removed again. With the manifold tight, we can now reinstall the coolant and the oil feeds. With the coolant and oil feeds hooked up to the turbo, we can move on to the rest of the accessories, like the charge pipe and downpipe. With the rest of the turbocharger assembly buttoned up, we can move on to assembling the front suspension, reinstalling the subframe, front steering components, and a few other accessories. Lastly, and arguably the most important step of this job, is completing a fresh oil change. We're going to be replacing the oil with Total's 0W40 9000 series oil to ensure it has maximum protection upon its first restart. We'll also replace the oil filter with a factory Hyundai oil filter to ensure any particulate matter is filtered out and that engine is maximally protected. Alright guys, we're all buttoned up on this 21 Veloster N. The hybrid turbo is installed and the break-in procedure is complete. We're ready to return the vehicle back to the customer for a retune, and then he's ready to enjoy all the benefits of that hybrid turbo. But before we let it go, let's get a sound clip.